Chattanooga history advocates are working to preserve the old Summit Cemetery near Ottawa. Thanks for joining us. I'm Kim Chapman-Whitfield.
And I'm Josh Rowe. The site is the home of the historic African-American burial ground that dates back to the 1890s. You can see on this map where the cemetery was eventually established.
Well, now advocates say the Hilltop Drive extension is proposing a road project that would threaten unmarked graves near the cemetery. Fox Chattanooga's Sarah Howard with one man on how his efforts to preserve the space are working.
One man I spoke with says his connection to this place is personal. His late former mother-in-law is buried nearby. He says that connection led him to start researching what happened to this cemetery.
The community lost access to its cemetery for decades.
Tucked away in the woods near Enterprise South Nature Park is a place Jared Story says most people never see. Here you can see it, Old Summit Cemetery, an African-American burial ground that's more than 100 years old.
The Old Summit Cemetery was the first cemetery in the Summit community.
According to these records, there could be more than 200 people buried here, many without headstones. Here you can see the ground dips, signs of unmarked graves. After decades without access, the cemetery faded into the woods. Records show the exact boundaries are still unclear, and graves may extend beyond the existing fence. Now Story says nearby development proposals are raising concerns about protecting what's left.
We don't want to do any further harm to that community by potentially encroaching on, their ancestors who were buried in that cemetery.
Those concerns are getting attention beyond the community. In this post from Save Enterprise South Nature Park, you can see a recommendation for the Tennessee State Historian to pause development around the site. The group points specifically to the unresolved Hilltop Drive extension, saying current and past road plans could run dangerously close to or even through cemetery grounds.
We don't think that there's a feasible route for the Hilltop Road extension that wouldn't potentially impact the cemetery or the nature park, or both.
For now, the cemetery remains hidden, but those fighting to protect it say honoring the people buried here is long overdue.
It's important to preserve what is left and honor those people that are buried there.
Sarah Howard, Fox Chattanooga.
And we reached out to Hamilton County asking how they intend to protect the Old Summit Cemetery from future development. We'll let you know when we hear back.
Tell me why this cemetery is historically important.
Sure. So the Summit Cemetery, which we refer to it as the Old Summit Cemetery, so it doesn't get confused with the one that the community currently uses that's called Summit Community Cemetery. So the Old Summit Cemetery was the first cemetery in the Summit community, and it was a African-American community that was settled after Reconstruction, from the best we can tell. So around the 1890s, the first churches in Summit were established in the 1890s. Fields Chapel, African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, and St. Peter's Missionary Baptist Church were both started right around the turn of the century. And so the cemetery, the earliest record that we have is 1919, but the WPA, the Works Projects Administration, did a survey of historic records in Hamilton County in 1938 and said that the cemetery had 200 unmarked burials. So it's likely that it started before 1919, but that's the earliest so far that we found in the research.
And who is buried here, and what do we know about them?
Sure. So a lot of the people buried in the Summit Cemetery are African Americans who moved from North Georgia, North Alabama during the period after Reconstruction, when there was a lot of increased repression and violence that happened right after Reconstruction, because there was a period where there was a little bit of protection from federal troops, and In some places, like in Chattanooga, Black folks who had moved into Chattanooga during and right after the Civil War had actually built some political power until the backlash happened after Reconstruction ended and Jim Crow laws were established. So the Summit community was started during that period, right after Reconstruction. People were moving north from North Alabama, North Georgia. And some folks had settled in Chattanooga first and then came to Summit. The cemetery was part of a large land acquisition that happened starting in 1941, for the federal government to acquire land for the ammunition plant. It was called Volunteer Ordnance Works at first, and then later the Volunteer Army Ammunition Plant. And a lot of folks in the community just called it the TNT plant because they made TNT there. But a big part of the northern part of Summit, which included the cemetery and one of the early churches, Mount Olive Primitive Baptist Church #2, was taken in that land acquisition. And so the community lost access to the cemetery. They put up a security perimeter around all of the land because obviously it was, producing munitions for World War II. So the community lost access to its cemetery for decades. But people in the community still remembered it, just weren't able to access it. And a couple of years after the land was taken, some men in the community purchased 2 acres on Sanders Road in Summit to create a cemetery for new burials. And my late former mother-in-law is buried in that newer cemetery. And that was kind of my connection, how I learned about the old cemetery, because my mother-in-law had told me that her father used to go over and try to keep it up as much as he could when he could get in to get access to it. And she knew the general area where it was, but didn't know exactly where it was. And so we were living over in the Hunter Village subdivision, which is adjacent to Enterprise South Nature Park. And there's trails that go behind the subdivision. And so one day, my wife at the time and I decided to walk back on the trail and see if we could come across the cemetery. And there it was. And so the private landowner at the time, it's not the same now, but at the time was not very receptive to inquiries about the status of the land at the time. And so we kind of let it ride for a while. And then the proposed Enterprise South McDonald Farm land swap came up, and I knew that was going to threaten the cemetery. And then I learned about the Hilltop Road extension proposal, which was an even closer threat to the actual location of the cemetery. So I started doing some more research to find out who some of the unmarked burials were, because there are only a few headstones that are still there that are legible, that we could, tell who was buried there. So I did research, and I was able to identify around 50 of the unmarked burials, but there's probably a lot more. And the ammunition plant, I think, put up barbed wire fencing around the cemetery at some point. But it's likely not the full extent of the cemetery because there's so many unmarked burials. The area that's fenced is just not large enough. And the Graham Perry from the Tennessee Historical Commission, he came out and did some visual surveying and some probing, and he determined that there are definitely unmarked burials outside the perimeter of the fence, which is very concerning because the initial engineering report plans for the Hilltop Road extension showed the route for the road going right alongside probably the fenced perimeter. And in that report, it said that there were no historical or cultural resources within the viewshed of the road, which is obviously false. So that was a big concern for us.
And why do you believe preserving this area is so important right now?
So just in terms of the cemetery, this community was established by people, not long out of enslavement. Um, some folks may have been free people of color, but likely a lot of them, if they were moving from North Georgia and North Alabama, were formerly enslaved or the descendants of formerly enslaved folks, and they were trying to establish community um, and have their own self-sufficient community, and then they were displaced by the government and lost access to their land and to their cemetery. And so I just think it's important to preserve what is left and honor those people that are buried there, and restore the cemetery as best that we can and preserve it and keep it from deteriorating any more than it already is,
And
so that those folks are resting in with some dignity.
and do you know how many graves are thought to be there, even unmarked ones?
Say that again.
Do you know how many graves that are there, even unmarked graves?
We don't know yet. There needs to be more of a study. There is a process they can use that's ground penetrating radar, or LIDAR, to detect graves, that's non-invasive. So, they're not doing any digging or anything. So that could be a way that we could establish how large it is and also how many exactly burials. But likely it's upwards of 200 because of the survey that was done in 1938. Then there were 4 more years before the community lost access to it. So there were more burials, I'm sure. And some of the records for death certificate records are between that period of 1938 and 1942. So definitely 200 or more.
What would you want the community to know most, and what can they do to help preserve this area?
Sure, just that we don't think that there's a feasible route for the Hilltop Road extension that wouldn't potentially impact the cemetery or the nature park, or both. And the public has already overwhelmingly opposed development, the park. So that leaves, the cemetery, and the fact that we don't know the boundaries is really concerning. And so we definitely would like to work with the county and potentially private property owner. It's a little unclear if the cemetery is completely on private property, partly on the nature park property. Not really sure yet. So we feel like the county needs to work with the descendants of the cemetery and the Summit community and come up with a plan to preserve the cemetery and maintain it and allow for better access, because there are still a lot of living descendants and even some elders who were very small children that were born when the community still had access to that land, and still there were families still living over there.
And what would you want to say to the people who make the decision of what to do here, if you could tell them one thing?
Sure, I think that it's a story of a community being displaced, and we don't want to do any further harm to that community by potentially encroaching on, their ancestors who were buried in that cemetery.
Absolutely. And then if there's anything else that you want to add, or anything that I didn't ask about that you think is important to include.
Sure, I think if folks think that they might have ancestors who were buried there, they could reach out to me at oldsummitcemetery@gmail.com. And I can look at the records that we have so far, and tell them potentially if they might have ancestors there.
Absolutely, that's awesome. And if you have any photos or videos of this area that you could share, that would be awesome as well. You have my number, so if you could just text those, that would be perfect.
Sure.
Do you
I've got a about a 4-minute YouTube video walkthrough I did of the cemetery, and then I've got photos that I can send.
Awesome, yeah, if you could send me all of that in the next like hour, that would be great.
Sure, I can do that.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.